Hello and welcome to the 2021 Ohioana Book Festival. My name is Bill Eichenberger and I'm an editor and writer for the Ohio History Connections membership publication Echoes magazine. And I'd like to welcome you to the panel around the Buckeye State. We'd like to thank our festival sponsors and partners, all of whom you can find listed on the Ohioana website. And thanks to our official bookseller, the Book Loft of German Village. You can get copies of all the books featured at the festival and on this panel by going online to bookloft.com. And let me just introduce our panelists today. Carole Genshaft is curator at large at the Columbus Museum of Art, where she has organized many exhibitions about the life and work of Amina Robinson. Dr. Genshaft has been with the museum since 1984 and was director of education from 1996 to 2006. She has an undergraduate degree in art history from Syracuse University, a master's degree in library science from Case Western Reserve University, and earned her doctorate in art education from the Ohio State University. Megan Griffiths is an adjunct professor in the Department of Biological Science at Kent State University. Over the past 2 decades, Dr. Griffiths studied plant-to-plant interactions with particular focus on understanding the mechanisms by which disturbance and competition impact plant communities. Kenn Kaufman burst onto the birding scene as a teenager in the 1970s, hitchhiking all over North America in pursuit of birds, an adventure that he later chronicled in his cult classic book, Kingbird Highway. His other books include Lives of North American Birds and Flights Against the Sunset. And his latest is A Season on the Wind, Inside the World of Spring Migration. Kenn is a field editor for Audubon, a fellow of the American Ornithological Society, and the only person to have received the American Birding Association's Lifetime Achievement Award twice. Dr. Bob Kroeger is a native of Youngstown, Ohio. Like me, I am also Bob. He graduated from Ohio State University's College of Dentistry and served 4 years of active duty in the U.S. Navy, ending with the rank of lieutenant commander. He's published 2 books on dentistry, a book on vitality, and 7 books on golf in Scotland, England, Wales, and Ireland, including To the 14th Tee, The Links of Wales, The Golf Courses of Old Tom Morris, and others. His book, this is his book that we'll be talking about today, is his first book on old barns. So I'm interested in that. Now, Norm Nite is a legendary broadcaster, disc jockey, and impresario, known by many as Mr. Music for his extensive knowledge of music history and popular culture. Nite hosted over half a dozen radio shows in New York and Cleveland during a 6-decade-long career, including a Sirius XM radio show broadcast live from the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. He's also chronicled the history of rock and roll music in his Rock On encyclopedias. So with those introductions out of the way now, I would just like to have you, if you've got a copy of the book, hold it up so people can see it, and tell us a little bit about what inspired you to write it and a little bit about what the book is about. And why don't you start, Carole?
Great. I'm going to try sharing my screen. See if that'll work.
Yes. Beautiful.
So this is my book, Ragging on the Art of Amina Brendelin Robinson's House and Journals. And so Amina Brendelin Robinson was a beloved Columbus artist. And when she passed away in 2015, I can't believe it's going to be 6 years ago, she left her entire estate, well, almost her entire estate, to the Columbus Museum of Art. And the staff went in and began sorting it out, figuring out what to do with everything. And to be quite honest, we were awestruck. There was so much in the house, and it was so inspiring, and it was kind of a sacred space that I certainly knew right away that it would make a great exhibition and accompanying book. So that's really how this book got started. I can just share, I think. not sure that's gonna work. So I'll just leave that there for the moment. But so at any rate, the book is really about the house and what we found in the house. And it also documents almost 7 decades of Amina's work, in which she said she was trying to fill the blank pages of American history with the ordinary and extraordinary lives and events of African Americans. And so that's what the book is all about.
Wonderful. Thanks, Carole. Megan Griffiths. There, Megan. Oh, you're on mute, Megan.
I'm unmuted. I'm unmuted
Okay, yeah.
now.
Okay.
So the short answer is that we decided to write this book because it didn't exist yet. In 2015, my husband, David Ward, who is a co-author on the book, was offered a professorship at Kent State University. And so we moved from South Africa to Ohio. And when we made that move, we were looking for a guide to the invasive plants and weeds found in the state. And we could only find one reference book for the Midwest and some fact sheets for maybe the 10 or so most common invasive species in Ohio, but not much information was really easily accessible beyond that. So we saw a gap and we decided to fill it by writing this book. This book is basically the resource that we wanted to have 5 years ago. And it introduces readers to about 150 non-native species of plants that you're likely to encounter in Ohio, either things that are considered to be invasive species or weeds of some description. And for each species, we've included a distribution map of this species, a history of their origin and introduction to North America, a really detailed description of the species, including lots of photographs with diagnostic features for identification, a summary of impact each species has on native plant communities, and then some ideas for control of the species. And in addition, especially for the species that have become invasive as a result of their use in horticulture, we've included suggestions of native plant species that can be grown as alternatives once the invasive species have been removed. As to the bigger question of why we thought this resource was needed, there is a growing understanding that non-native plant species are problematic, not just in natural settings, but also in our gardens and in our landscaping. The issue is that non-native species just don't support wildlife very well. This is certainly an issue when non-native plants become invasive in natural settings, but it's also an issue in our gardens and the landscaping. So if you have only non-native turf grass lawn, non-native shrubs, non-native ornamental trees, there are not going to be very many species of insects, birds, and mammals that can survive long-term in a landscape like that. So choosing to limit species like those that are covered in our book, and instead using native plants makes for better habitat for all the other species in the environment. This is something that we all can do, whether we are plant people or bird people, whether we live in cities or out in rural areas. It's something we all can do. And I think especially right now, when even more than ever, people are spending more time at home and connecting with the nature on their doorstep, we think it's a resource that could be useful to everyone.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. Kenn, tell us about A Season on the Wind.
Okay, thanks, Bill. Yeah, A Season on the Wind, Inside the World of Spring Migration, published just a couple of years ago. It's about bird migration. I've been deeply interested in birds ever since I was a little kid, and have gone to places around the world to observe visible bird migration. But about 15 years ago, I moved from Arizona to northwestern Ohio, which is actually one of the great hotspots for observing spring migration in all of North America. Is you have these small birds that are moving north, coming from the tropics, and they get to the edge of Lake Erie and they pause to sort of like, okay, what do we do next? So there are these huge concentrations of these migratory songbirds, colorful little things like warblers and tanagers and orioles and buntings. And it's such a spectacle that people come here from all over North America and even from other continents to observe the peak of the spring migration in May. And after I had lived here for a few years, I was just so captivated by it that I wanted to share it, to share not just the science, but also the sense of magic of seeing these little travelers come back to visit.
Right. Well, that's great. Bob, tell us about how you came to write or do the drawings and stuff for the barns.
I will be happy to do that. This is the book. I don't have a screen share.
Yeah,
but
that's okay. You can see it perfectly.
You can see it. And it happened almost mysteriously or spiritually about 10 years ago by seeing a little barn in Licking County. We were there on a weekend, and it's like a thunderbolt right between my eyes. You're going to paint this barn, you're going to write about it, you're going to preserve Ohio history. And that's how it started. And to be honest, living in the suburbs here, I knew nothing about old barns. Mm-hmm. It was just an incredible epiphany. And so I did a little research, and I think I want to make two key points about these old barns and why they're significant in Ohio. Number one, they were the money makers. Back in the 1800s, Ohio was a huge forest, and a pioneer would come in, cut down some trees, make a log home. He'd live in it for a while. And the first structure he would build would be a barn. And this barn would house the crops and protect the livestock in the wintertime. And without the barn, you wouldn't be able to support a family. Most people in those days were very, very poor farmers, and they needed that barn. And the way they built them was incredible. These folks did not have college degrees. They weren't architects. They weren't engineers, but they could chop down a 50, 80-foot tree, square it up with their axes and adzes, cut a little groove in it called a mortise, which is like a little slot, cut another groove, cut another piece in another beam called tenon, which was like a tongue, and that would fit into the mortise. Then they'd use a hand auger to drill a hole, and they'd use a wooden peg to fasten it together. And that mortise and tenon joint still survives over 100, 200 years, 300 years in the East Coast cases. And it just amazes me. So the idea of the old barn being a moneymaker, being an incredible architecture was fascinating to me, along with the stories that popped up left and right, which illustrate not only Ohio history, but also in some cases, national history. And that's how the book evolved.
Wonderful. Thanks, Bob. Norm, tell us how you came to write the book about the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and Museum. I mean, obviously, and I'm going to get to asking you the story about when Leslie Gore called you, but just tell us a little bit about your book.
Well, thank you, William. And here is the book. And of course, the book is called The House That Rock Built. You know, it's interesting that the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame is open for almost over a quarter of a century. It opened up in September of 1995. And the interesting thing is, just like on the cover of the book, it says how it took time, money, music moguls, corporate types, politicians, media, artists, and fans to bring the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame to Cleveland. The Hall of Fame is here, but everyone wonders, how did Cleveland get the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and why? My journey on this thing started in 1982. And until the Hall of Fame opened on September 1st, 1995, 13 years were involved in this because I felt there was a story here because at that particular time in 1982, I was living in New York doing a radio show for CBS. And so many people would ask me in New York, how come Cleveland it wasn't designated at that particular time, but there were talks about possibly putting a Hall of Fame in Cleveland, and a lot of people, and then when it did happen, when Cleveland was announced as a site for the Hall of Fame in 1986, more questions came up. Why? How come it's there? It should be in Memphis. It should be in New Orleans. It should be in New York. And that's when I started to really look into how this could happen. And I started doing interviews with so many of the people that were involved in it. And I got my good friend Tom Farron, who was a great writer for the Cleveland Plain Dealer, involved. And we sat down and we talked about this whole thing, and then it ultimately came to be. So there's a fascinating story about it, but I'm very, very proud of the fact that all the top people in Cleveland, all the top politicians and everything else, all the top people in New York got behind the book and made it a reality. And like everyone else on this panel, we're very proud of the work that we produced.
One of the things first of all, like you say, 25 years ago, or 1995, and so it wasn't a foregone conclusion the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame would be in Cleveland. And I kind of liked in the book, I thought it was interesting when you talk about that what the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame could have been, which might have just been an inauspicious building in Brooklyn with a bunch of plaques on the walls.
Well, the whole key for me in all of this, there was a lot of discussion. I'll never forget when I got a phone call from Mike Benz in Cleveland in 1985 to fly into Cleveland, which I did in May of '85. And we had a meeting in the office. And at that particular meeting, there was Hank LeConte, Mike Benz, Jules Belkin, Bill Smith of WMMS, Bill Bryant. And they said to me at that particular time, I know you're involved with the people in New York with the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Would you consider pitching Cleveland as a site for the Hall of Fame? And I said, you know, they're way underway on doing this in New York. But I'll tell you what, I'll see what I can do. And I went and left that meeting. I flew to LaGuardia. At the airport, I called up Ahmet Ertegun, the CEO and the man who was in charge of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and the president of Atlantic Records. And I said, Ahmet, could I come by your office and talk to you? And he said, sure. I went right from the airport to his office in Midtown Manhattan. I'll never forget that afternoon. I walked in, sat down. He said, what's on your mind? I said, well, I just left a group of Clevelanders who would love to have the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Cleveland, Ohio. And he said, absolutely not, because Mayor Koch has promised us a brownstone on 42nd Street. And what we're going to do, we're just going to have a simple place where we'll put some plaques up and we'll have a induction every year and we'll put some mementos in there. And that's what their small thinking was. And had I gotten up and shook his hand and said, Ahmet, thank you for your time, and left his office and called up Mike Benz in Cleveland and said, Mike, we have to pass. It's not going to happen. Just think about history. That window of opportunity was closing. And you know, when you hear people say, never take no for an answer. Well, this was my opportunity. I said to Ahmet, I said, Ahmet, you have to consider Alan Freed, who coined the phrase rock and roll, did the first show in Cleveland in 1952. It's a neutral city. It doesn't have like California, the surf sound and Motown in Detroit or anything else. It's between Pittsburgh, Chicago, Cleveland. You got a lot of opportunity. I must have hit the right button because he called out to Susan Evans, who was the top person involved in the project in the outer office. And Susan, when is our next board meeting? And she said, July 18th. She says, well, put Norman's name down because he wants to be able to bring some people in to pitch Cleveland for the site for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. I left the meeting. I called up Mike. I says, I got your foot in the door. You got a meeting in New York on July 18th. He said, well, you got to come to Cleveland and work with us in putting this presentation together. So the point of this whole story is this. If somebody tells you no, never take no for an answer. Because had I taken no for an answer on that afternoon in May of 1985, there would be no Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Cleveland. And all the things that have happened. And you know, the interesting thing about this, it's a signature of our town because, for example, Seattle has a Space Needle, and the Eiffel Tower in Paris and the Statue of Liberty in New York. Now that, in fact, when they have the draft, the NFL draft next week in Cleveland, where are all these people going to go to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame? What do they all think about besides sports? Rock and roll. So it is such an important thing to Cleveland, and I am just so proud that the people got behind it and it made it a reality.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Norm. Bob, it seems like you've had a decade-long love affair with Ohio barns. You touched on it in your introduction, but what drew you to these barns? You said that sort of lightning bolt moment hit you, but what was it about them? And then to keep you going on and on to see all these various barns?
Well, I'll tell you this, if you can do a zoom of that, is
Yes.
a collapsed old barn.
Mhm.
And I visited that last week on another barn tour in Hawking County. Well, I saw it first in 2018 when it was in pretty bad shape, but I liked it. So I did a sketch and some photos and did a painting of it for a fundraiser. And when I went back last week, she told me it collapsed. And so then that's when I realized that's why I do this, to preserve a piece of history
Mhm.
on a painting and an essay, maybe framed in the barn's own wood.
Uh-huh. Oh, that's great.
That's Knox County, one of my favorites, the Salt Box. Anyway, and then maybe if somebody sees the painting 50 to 100 years from now and reads the essay about it, they'll relive a little bit about the sacrifices our ancestors did to build this great state. And that's how it clicked.
Yeah.
And then the process took a long time, even though my father was an artist and a very good artist. I hadn't done art in a long time. So it was back to the basics, perspective, proportion, lessons, workshops, you name it, you know, so it's evolved.
Yep. That's really interesting. Thanks. Ken, bring us back to the 1970s and tell us what about birds attracted you so that you were going to dedicate the rest of your life to them?
That's it's a hard question to answer. I mean, I really got interested. I became fascinated with birds when I was about 6 years old. I mean, up to that point, I had looked at picture books about nature and looking for big nature, like elephants and bears and dinosaurs. But we were living in a little neighborhood in northern Indiana. We didn't have any of those things. So when I was about 6, I thought I'd take a minute or two to figure out what these birds were out on the lawn, and I've been working on that ever since. But they're just, their lives are just so amazing. It's like this alternate universe, and these creatures are living all around us and living these amazing lives. But I think once people start to realize that they're out there, it's hard not to be fascinated by them.
And I think so many people, they couldn't name a single bird. Like they birds fly in and out of their yards and they don't pay much attention. But you're drilling down to repeat visits, on migration or and then sort of kind of the lives of these birds. So
that's right. Let me see if I can do a screen share here. Let's see if I'm technologically advanced enough to do that. Can you see that?
yes, beautiful.
Okay, this tiny bird, it's called a black-throated green warbler. It's less than 5 inches long, it weighs less than an ounce. But this bird nests in forests up mostly across eastern Canada, spends the winter in the tropics, mostly from southern Mexico down to northern South America, and it will fly back and forth every year, fly south in fall, fly north in spring. But that little bird might stop in any tree in the state of Ohio during its northward migration. So even during a period when we're under lockdown and we can't really travel around much, we still can go out and just look around on a spring morning, and there might be some little bird in your backyard that just flew in from Ecuador. And I just think it makes the world seem more amazing and more three-dimensional.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. Megan, you kind of addressed this in your introduction, but tell me again why invasive species are such a, maybe it goes beyond being a nuisance, but why should people really care about invasive species?
Yeah, so the big issue, invasive species are the worst because they are the species that get established in natural communities, and then they usually outcompete all the native species or most of the native species. And then so they're occupying much of the space in the ecosystem, but they're not providing many services. In particular, very few insect species can eat the leaves of non-native plants because they don't share an evolutionary history. oak trees, the leaves of oak trees are full of chemicals that defend against herbivory by little insects. But those little insects have co-evolved with oak trees. And so they are able to detoxify some of those chemicals or sequester them. So they are able to eat, the insects are able to eat oak leaves. But a Norway maple that's introduced from Europe doesn't share any evolutionary history with insects. And when the insects eat the leaves, they die. So why do we care about insects? Well, they're basically, plants are at the base of the food web in terrestrial systems, and insects are not next up. And then there are all the things that eat the insects. So those black-throated green warblers that migrate through, they eat the caterpillars growing on the oak trees. If you have a Norway maple in your front garden instead of an oak tree, then that migrating bird is going to land on the tree and it's not going to have anything to eat. So obviously invasive species are the worst, but even the non-native species that are in our yards make a big difference. And yeah, if you're a bird person, then you should care about having native plants in your yard.
That's great. Thank you. Carole, so sort of having a background in history and museums, could you talk to me about, I mean, what an awesome thing it must have been to go through Amina's estate and tell us some of the highlights, things that you found that were just so surprising and wonderful.
I would be glad to. I'm going to try this one more time. It might not work. Oh yeah, here we go. This will work because I can show you just a little bit. I think. So this is her house, and she had lived there for 40 years. And the house is the east side of Columbus in the Shepherd community. And one of the first things we noticed is that the doors she carved were kind of deteriorating. So we actually had those taken off and preserved, and they will be, there's a vinyl reproduction that's actually up now because the conservator said that we could never put them back on, they would weather again. So that was just, you know, introduction. Also you see her bottle garden. The bottle garden Beautiful, is to keep evil spirits out. And the wagon wheel represents African cosmology. So everything in Amina's house was kind of curated in a way. This is the living room. I tend to, when I talk to people, I say, if you've had a parent or a grandparent who passed away and you had to go through their house and figure out what to do with it, multiply that by about 50 or 100, because Amina was a saver, a collector, and she had this amazing work ethic where she would get up at 4:30, 4 o'clock in the morning and work well until the evening. So we found stacks of art. And one of the more surprising things is that we found over 150 journals. And many of them are, you know, in addition to being a visual artist, she was really a wonderful writer as well. There's poetry, there's prose, and then there's fabulous illustrations in these journals. So that's part of the book as well. But you can just get a picture of what, this is the living room, and Amina actually slept on this couch. This is a rag-on that she did in the front of the, that she had going in the living room. Every room of the house was either for storing art or making art. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of what we were trying to, this is her new studio. She won a MacArthur in 2004. And she was then able to add a new studio to the back of the house. And this is that studio. That was some of the work she was working on, you know, really towards the end of her life. Many of these are in the exhibition. And she had surprisingly turned a small bathroom on the second floor into the writing room. And both that studio and this writing room, very few people had ever seen. They were her private spaces. She called them her sanctuary. So we were able to dismantle that. And that the pictures are in the book, but we've also reconstructed this room in the exhibition. And again, it was to give visitors and readers the awe that we experienced in just going through this wonderful trove of, really, it was like being on a treasure hunt. It was, and as I said, we're still going through things. Many things were boxed up, and it will take more years. Her books, for example, she really lived in a library. This is a chair she made. So the books aren't just books, but she would annotate the books and underline them, and then sometimes make little drawings. So the books become a primary source for, we hope, future research to be done. So yeah, it was really a privilege to do, and just, the book hopefully captures some of that spirit, as does the exhibition that's up at the museum until October.
Good. Okay, that's fantastic. I just can't imagine the excitement. I mean, and it's because you knew Amina and had worked with her and studied her work for 30 years. And do you ever start to feel like maybe I know everything there is to know about Amina, and here we go with we don't, and now we're going to have researchers for generations probably going through.
Yes, I'm telling you, every day was, and I actually read all these journals, and it was quite eye-opening to understand her process and her thoughts. And she had so much talent that was evident as a young child, and to just see where she took that. She learned traditional kinds of art making from her parents, but she also went to the Columbus College of Art and Design. So she just, I like to say, she created her own visual and artistic vocabulary that, you see here in the chair, for example, that she made that went in the house because when she bought the house in 1974, there was no furniture. And she said, well, I'll just make some. And there you have it. So that's, yes, we learned so much just you can imagine going through what we found in the house. We have 7, besides myself, there are 7 contributors to the catalog who write about different aspects of her work. And, we're really hoping that, being the keepers of the estate, that we spread her legacy. She's quite well known in Columbus and Ohio, but we want to make sure people all over really the world come to know her work as well.
I'm not sure if this is off topic or not, but is that house going to become a museum or a place for people to visit?
I'm so glad you asked. So we actually had a committee of arts people and neighbors and relatives, and they voted unanimously, as did our board, to turn the house into a artist residency for African-American artists. So the Columbus Foundation gave us a grant. We renovated the house. It was completed last year, and our first resident artist will be moving in next month. So he was supposed to come a year before, but because of COVID. So we're very excited about that. And I can tell you, I just recently came across an entry in some of Amina's writing where she actually said she hoped that someday perhaps the house could be a residence for artists. We didn't really know that. We thought she would love this idea. She mentored so many young artists and other artists. So I think it's really a wonderful use of the house. And we're excited, as I said, to welcome our first artist soon.
That is exciting. That's great. Norm, I wanted to ask you, how did Cleveland come to be? What was it about Cleveland? It became a rock and roll town. I mean, I grew up in Youngstown, and I would always try and tune into WMMS and Cleveland. But what happened with Cleveland? How did it become a rock town?
Well, it all began with one gentleman, Alan Freed.
Right.
Alan Freed came up from Akron, Ohio to Cleveland, Ohio in 1951 to do a show on WJW radio called The Moondog Show, and got together with Leo Mintz, the owner of Record Rendezvous on Prospect Avenue, and was promoting this music. And a lot of people, it was all race music, black artists. And the people thought that the people that were buying these records were primarily Black. But much to the amazement of Alan Freed, when he talked to Leo Mintz, many of the people that came into the record rendezvous were white.
Mhm.
So that's where he had, and he called himself the Moondogger. And they thought it would be an interesting idea to crown him the king of the Moondogs and have a Moondog coronation ball.
Yes.
They wanted to do it at the Cleveland Arena on Friday, March 21st, 1952. In fact, it's kind of interesting because next year it'll be 70 years that took place. So they went and decided to have this concert with many Black artists on the bill. And they thought, and the only way you could sell tickets at that was at Burroughs or at the Cleveland Press or anything else like that. There were no Ticketrons and outlets and everything else. So they never thought there'd be that many people showing up. The arena held 10,000 people. They had the Barons hockey games there and everything else and ice capades and all that stuff. So anyway, they decided to do this show, not realizing that tens of thousands of people would show up, broke down the doors. There was a riot. And at that particular time, they thought that this was the end of Alan Freed. And he came on the radio the next day on Saturday, apologized to the people of Cleveland and said, listen, I'm sorry what happened last night. We had no idea so many people would come. I want to make it up to you. But he said something very important that evening. He said, I'm here for you. If you thought what I did last night was not right, then call us, let me know, send us a telegram, call the phone station. And if you don't want me on the air, I will disappear. And had the people at that particular time called up and said, get off the air, we hated what you did, that would have ended Alan Freed's career and that would have ended the rock and roll whole thing. But they overwhelmingly supported him. WJW put him on the air 6 days a week. And for the next couple of years, all he kept talking about was rock and roll. Well, they called it rhythm and blues at that time, race music. Right. But he eventually coined the phrase rock and roll. And then in September of '54, he went to New York. But that was the beginning. And of course, and I'm very, very proud of the fact that the very first induction ceremony in January 23rd, 1986, I, along with the late Scott Muni, inducted Alan into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And that was a terrific honor for me because growing up and listening to him on the radio and everything else in Cleveland, and then seeing how he was the guy responsible for this whole thing called rock and roll, to be able to induct him into the Hall of Fame. But when you ask the question, it all began with Alan Freed. And then, of course, there were disc jockeys like Bill Randall and Tommy Edwards and a lot of other disc jockeys through the years that kept the banner going and everything else. And later on, Kid Leo and all the guys at MMS. But Cleveland, if you have to point one finger to one person, it was Alan Freed.
We have a feature in our magazine called "I Wish I'd Been There," where we ask somebody an event they would wish they'd seen in person, and one of our writers did the Moondog coronation ball, and we had a really great picture from the Cleveland Press collection of like empty bottles strewn, broken in glass. Right. And it was like it looked like a tornado had hit the place.
William, can you believe next year is going to be 70 years?
That's crazy.
70 years since that started.
That's crazy. Let me switch over. Bob, are you done with barns? Have you seen them all? Have you seen all Ohio barns, or
No.
looking at a potential part two? Or
I'll be doing this the rest of my life. They just found a round barn in Dayton that goes back to 1874, an octagonal. Somebody alerted it to me. I'm working on round barns throughout America. Less than 1%, very interesting. Some circular, some octagonal, some 16-sided, as the one is on the cover of my book, which is in a very, very hard spot to get. It's a little red thing up there.
Yeah.
It's the only 16-sided barn in Ohio. Wow. The owner proudly told me. And to find it was a challenge, believe me. But I'd like to give a little plug to a fundraiser we're going to have. It was supposed to be held in May, but the organizers decided to move it to September 29th. And it's a fundraiser for local nonprofits in Butler County. and it will have all 88 paintings, one from each county, along with some other people and some book signings and stuff like that. But it's in a very historic barn, traces back to the beer industry in Cincinnati. Back in the 19th century, it was a huge German town, and the Germans love their beer. And believe me, this is where they grew the hops, way up in Westchester in Butler County, in this barn. It was going to be taken down, but Westchester heard about it, and they moved it, believe it or not, to a wonderful little place above a pond. They paid for it to be reconstructed, and it's one of the most wonderful barn restorations I have ever seen. It's a treasure. And since 2008, they've held over 1,000 events in it. And this will be one more. And the details are at my website, robertkroeger.com. Just go to the events page.
Yeah.
So you're all welcome.
I was going to ask you something that fell right on my head. I'll come back to it. But I was going to ask you about we talked about beer in Cincinnati, and the name is escaping me. Who is the big brewer in Cincinnati?
Well, this particular one was called the Windish Mulhauser Brewery. It stretched about 2 city blocks long, had 2 huge stone lines, each weighed 10 tons on the roofs. It was amazing. There was Christian Moorline, there was Hudipole, there were tons of brewers. And it was a huge drinking town. In 1893, the average consumption was 40 gallons every man, woman, and child, 2.5 times the national average. Carrie Nation, the anti-temperance scout, came to town in 1902. She takes one look down Vine Street. She counts 136 pubs. She just leaves. She says, I would have dropped dead from exhaustion if I decided to stay. So anyway, that's just a little story about this Mulhauser barn.
That's terrific. Thanks. Kenn, let's talk a little bit more about birds. I'm wondering, bring me back. I'm just curious. This is just for my own edification, but talk to me about the making of Kingbird Highway.
Oh, okay. Well, that
is that okay? I mean,
sure. I mean that was different. When I was a kid, my family was living in Kansas, and I was a rabid little birder. I did okay in school, but every minute of my spare time, I was out looking for birds. And there's decent birding in Kansas, but there are a lot of things that you're not going to see there. So at the age of 16, I much to the horror of my parents, I dropped out of school and started hitchhiking around North America looking for birds. And it was the early 1970s. And at that point, hitchhiking was a very common way of traveling. There were just, thousands of kids out there doing it. So I hitchhiked around coast to coast, discovering, going to all the great birding spots, meeting other young people, other kids my age who were crazed birders. And in 1973, I decided to see if I could set a record for the largest number of birds seen in one year, traveling entirely by hitchhiking. So I hitched to Alaska and back. When I was in Florida like 5 times during the year, just back and forth. And I sort of set a record. And afterwards, it occurred to me that had been really an interesting experience. So I wrote this manuscript about it, which was terrible. The first draft was just awful. And I threw it in a box and left it there for several years. But then in the early 1990s, I dug it out and shortened it quite a lot and revised. And eventually the book was published in 1996, and it's still in print. And I'm happy about it. People see it seemed to relate to the sort of coming of age story there.
Right, absolutely. Megan, let's go back and talk about, I'm looking at the time too. We're getting close to almost being out of time. Let's go one more question about, so tell me a little bit, you mentioned this, but who took the photographs and how many are there in the book? And tell me about, let people know what's inside the book.
Well, yeah, it was an interesting process. At the start of the project, I thought I was going to take the time to learn how to be a really good plant photographer. And I quickly learned that I didn't have the skill or the time to become a good photographer. And also, we discovered that there was a fantastic database of open source photos that are available. So many researchers have made their pictures of invasive species available. And so there are over 900 photographs, color photographs in the book, covering all of the different diagnostic features for each species. So it really does help with identification. And we have either used open source photos or photographs that we got permission from the photographers to use for the book. But it was a huge undertaking to source all of the photos. So, but still probably a lot faster than me trying to learn how to be a really good photographer and track down all of the different plants at the right time of year to get all of these different pictures.
Right.
But that was a huge part of the job that I hadn't realized how big it was going to be.
I'm envisioning an Excel spreadsheet or something. I don't know, how did you keep track of when you needed the picture and when?
Lots and lots of documents. Yes.
Carole, let me ask you, the title is fabulous, Ragging On, but why don't you tell people what the title means and what Amina meant by ragging on?
So Amina's idea was different from many artists traditionally. She didn't, and the more we found the things in her house, there's a lot of unfinished work, for example. So as she would have a lot of projects going at the same time, and she would come back to them or not. And the whole idea of a rag-on, which she coined that term, and to best understand, it's really understood as rag on and on. So she would start a work. I showed you one that was in the living room. She would add to it, and she would never really see the whole thing until she might take it outside eventually and unroll it in the driveway, or sometimes we'd bring it to the museum on a Monday when we were closed and unroll it. So her idea was that these are very complex works of art, often layered, often encrusted with beads and found objects. They might have music box workings in them. They might have pockets that held books in addition, often. And so the ideas was that she could add on to it, but more importantly is that you, the viewer, or the reader who sees this in the book, would add your own ideas. You'd have your own interpretations. And I can tell you, it's really a wonderful way to think about art as we bring people through the exhibition. Again, you just learn so much from what other people find there. And she would love that. And so that's where the term comes from.
Right. I love the idea of her art being kind of a living entity. That it was never maybe quite done, or that that she could add to it at a later date. So
she often she would laugh when we put on white gloves to handle her work. She wanted people to be able to touch it, and of course you can't in a museum. But a lot of it is fabric and textile, and it is very tempting for people.
Yeah, I can imagine. Okay, we're getting towards the end of our time here. And so I'm going to ask all of you panelists, tell me, and I'll also encourage our viewers to get out a pen and paper and write stuff down or whatever, but talk to me about, Carole, about a question I didn't ask you about the book that you really wanted to get across today. And then also, where people can get more information.
So I think what is so amazing about the book and the exhibition and about Amina's work, I joke all the time, like I could have taken over the entire Columbus Museum of Art with this exhibition, but we only had so much space. So the book does a really good job of showing her early work, which there are watercolors, oils, graphite work from when she was like eight years old and on to her teen years that are just amazing. And then it shows this progression of how her work, developed and changed, but in some ways stayed the same. And while it's very much a lot about the history of Columbus, it's also very universal, certainly of many other cities in the United States that went through the same kind of urban renewal kinds of things, the segregation era. And I think it speaks to people all over the country, all over the world. She traveled as well, and some of that's in the book. So I think what it does is really, just gives an indication of how vast her work and how really her mind was quite wonderful. And also we interviewed 30 people for the exhibition and the criteria was that they had been to the house.
Mhm.
And the word that came often was sacred, spiritual. She talked about people that were mentors to her who were anointed. And honestly, I believe she was anointed. She had these powers, she just had this wonderful ability to listen and to really look at people and to kind of understand them just in this very spiritual way. So hopefully some of that's captured in the book.
Wonderful.
And
Yeah.
and we hope it really does invite a vast, an ever widening audience to know her work.
Yeah. Right.
And I invite everybody to come to the Columbus Museum of Art before October 3rd.
Right.
It's a great place to come, even during COVID. You have to make reservations, but it's very safe as far as social distancing and masking. And it's really a great place to come for kids as well.
Definitely on my calendar, Carole.
Right. Let me know.
Okay, I will. Megan, what didn't I ask you that you wanted to touch on, or what should people know about your book that we haven't discussed?
Well, really, the parting point that I would want to make is, while we're all at home spending time looking at what's right outside our back door, I think we all have the capability to start making some positive changes to the environment in which we live. Or work or go to school, even if you rent a property. Talk with your landlord about planting a few things here and there that might be providing better habitat for all the other species that are around. It's a change that I think everyone is going to need to get involved in. And so I highly encourage people to take the time to start to learn the difference between a sugar maple and a Norway maple. And of course, there are great writers out there like Doug Tallamy, who's just written a fantastic book about the nature of oaks being one of the keystone species for Eastern North America and for the forests here. There are all sorts of great resources out there to help people along the way. Master gardener organizations and county extension agencies can help point people in the right direction. But it's definitely something that I think that everyone can and should be involved in.
Right, great. Kenn, tell me something I don't know, or tell me something that we didn't talk about that you think you want people to know about your book.
Okay, yeah, well, in A Season on the Wind, it's about bird migration in general, and I bring in information from other parts of the world, but the focus is on northwestern Ohio and following the sequence of the season from the first beginnings of migration in February through the peak in May. And I'd like people to know that there's this amazing diversity that comes through. There are more than 200 different kinds of birds that come through northwestern Ohio every spring, and sometimes in amazing concentrations, so much so that people will come here from Europe or South Africa or Australia to see the bird migration.
Wow.
And for us, it's essentially in our backyard. And I would just like people in Ohio to realize what a treasure we have.
Are there some online resources for people, or what time of the spring should you go up there? Where should you go? Are there particular cities or habitats that?
Okay, well, For a quick source, I would suggest going to the website of the Black Swamp Bird Observatory.
Okay.
You can just, you can Google that. They've got, I'm not officially connected to them, but they do all kinds of research in this area. They have tons of resources on their website. You can find out all about the timing of migration and lots of different places to go.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. Bob, what did you want to say about your book that I didn't bring up today?
Did I get lost? Can you still see me?
Yeah, I can see you.
Okay, good. That's good because I can't see anybody now. Anyway, I think, as I mentioned earlier, the old barns don't mean too much to people who live in the suburbs or the cities, and I fall into that category. But if you drive outside into the rural areas, as Ken probably does when he looks for birds, you'll see barns falling apart left and right. And so I want the barn to be recognized before they're gone, and they will be gone 50, 100 years from now. I also would like to mention that this year I'll be doing a couple dozen events, mostly for historical societies whose goals are like mine, to preserve history. And as you know, they've been hurt by the COVID, and that their fundraisers have all been canceled. So these fundraisers will hopefully raise a little bit of money for them in various cities. And I do a painting as a demonstration painting of an old barn using what's called a palette knife instead of a brush. And I paint thickly. That's called impasto. I'm sure Carole understands that. And then for a while, maybe half an hour to an hour, I'll tell barn stories, which are the second half of this book. And then I'll do a book signing. So feel free to come and support these historical societies. And if you happen to come there, I look forward to talking with you. Thanks.
Terrific. Norm, what do you want to leave us with? You get the last word.
Okay. Two things about the book, which is very, very important. First of all, on the back of the book, I was very, very honored. These are comments that they wrote. Stevie Van Zandt, who was one of the major performers in rock and roll with Bruce Springsteen and also was in the Sopranos, everything else, his comment. Jan Wenner, editor, co-founder and publisher of Rolling Stone magazine. Greg Harris, president and CEO of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Terry Stewart, former CEO of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And Richard F. Celeste, governor of Ohio from 1983 to 1991. The things that they had to say about the book were just unbelievable. And the reviews have been unbelievable as well. And for more information, they can go to KentStateUniversityPress.com. And the other thing, which is the most important thing, is this. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame cost $92 million to build. $199 million annual income for the Northeastern Ohio. 12 million visitors, 80% of them come from out of town to the Hall of Fame. $2 billion have been generated for Cleveland, Cuyahoga County economy. 570,000 visitors in 2018 alone. 127 million annually spent by Rock and Roll Hall of Fame visitors. 1,800 jobs have been generated, and 59.9 million total wages have been generated, and 36.5 million economic impact on the induction ceremonies, which will return to Cleveland this October 30th. So what the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame has been a major, and I mean that, major impact financially for the state of Ohio, Cleveland, Ohio, Northeastern Ohio. And the book, How Cleveland Got the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, tells that story. So what I'm proud of in conclusion is the fact that the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame has been a major, major impact on the city of Cleveland, and my book tells the story.
Right. Wonderful. Thanks, Norm. Well, I'd like to thank all of our panelists. So thank you, Megan and Bob, Norm, Ken, Carole. A reminder that you can get copies of all the books that we talked about today from our authors from the Book Loft of German Village at bookloft.com. And thanks again to our festival sponsors and partners. And thank you for joining us on this discussion. I found it fascinating. I hope you guys do too. Please check out the Ohioana website for all this year's festival programming.
Thank you, Bill.